question maybe for the folks who are here in the audience, but I think Martha can respond to the questions about how we've defined reducing reliance on the Delta.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you. I think we recognize in coming into this policy that there was a very... Sorry.
Press the red button down. Try it again.
Is that it? Now can I talk? Yeah. I think it's important to at least put context around this policy and go back in time. And the recognition in the 2009 legislation, there was a very, very strong debate over what reduced reliance meant. And we had some of those presentations here in this room when we were considering the reduced reliance policy. There were those who felt very strongly that the only interpretation of reduced reliance was an absolute reduction in the amount of water that was being received from the Delta. And there were those who felt very strongly that is not what it meant. When we looked at the policy and were thinking about it in terms of what agencies were actively doing in their urban water management plans, and most specifically, following the 2009 Reform Act being adopted, there was a provision in the budget bill for grant funding for integrated regional water management plans that very specifically said, what are you going to do to reduce dependence on the Delta in order to qualify for the grant funding? And we looked at the responses from the grantees in terms of people or agencies located in Southern California, in the San Joaquin Valley, in the Sacramento Valley, in the Delta area, in the Bay Area, and in the mountain counties. And all of them, in responding to that question, talked about those places where they felt that there were changes they could make that were an absolute reduction. But most of them actually talked about it in terms of the value of diversifying their water supplies, and most particularly the role of conservation and water efficiency in reducing demand and therefore becoming less reliant on those Delta supplies within the watershed. And so we purposefully relied upon that information in order to shape the criteria that we're using for this policy, and recognizing that for some water agencies, they can and will choose to use less water from the Delta. And we should respect that and respect the role in which that plays in being a part of helping the Delta. We're also looking at those agencies that are making the choice, and at times are required to, on the efficiency side, becoming more efficient and diversifying those water supplies. So as a percentage, even if they were to use more Delta water, as a percentage, it's a smaller percentage of this diversification strategy, which includes, and conservation is specifically included in the policy, as counting as part of the reduced reliance and part of the diversification of the supplies. So we felt that this was, and this is our recommendation to the Council, that in trying to thread this needle, that the direction for California that was really an important message was that everybody needed to do their part to be more efficient, to diversify those water supplies, and where they chose to, they could choose to use less from the Delta. The final part of the answer, I think, to your question is we did go back and look at urban water management plans for different water agencies who would raise the question, given their urban water management plans and what they were projecting for the future, would they today qualify and be able to say, I'm in compliance with the policy? There is not one agency that has shown me their urban water management plan where I could not show them how, on the basis of what they're planning to do today, particularly with the compliance with the 20 by 2020, that they would not be in compliance with this policy. So this is a forward-looking policy that is trying to provide an affirmative approach to helping to find solutions that help the Delta improve water supply for the state of California, and do it in a way that fits in with better, improved water management.
So in the criteria for a water supplier, it's complete an urban or agricultural water management plan, identify and commence implementation programs that are feasible, right, Martha?
Yes.
And 3 is the expected outcome for reduction in delta reliance. And the expected outcome for measurable reduction in delta reliance and improvement in regional self-reliance shall be reported in the plan as the reduction in the amount of water used, that would be an absolute lowering of export, or in the percentage of water used from the watershed compared to other sources. Is that right?
I want to make sure I understand your question when you compare it to other sources.
Well, I mean, see, whether as the reduction or a reduction in the percentage of water used, so percentage represents a portion of something.
Right.
What's the rest?
Within the urban and the agricultural water management plans, there's a template that we all follow in preparing these plans. And so one of the templates is you do an analysis by 5-year increments of how much water you're using. And then you have a similar chart that's showing the different sources of supply. And those are also evaluated in terms of 5-year increments. So
there's a pie chart, in effect, that is in each of the urban water management plans that would indicate different sources, whether it be local
exactly.
or outside the region or reuse.
For example, if I were to use West Basin's urban water management plan, which is one of the documents I referred to, and they do show the way in which they're planning their future for water supplies in the terms of a pie chart. It's drawn from the table. But what you see aggregated there is all the different sources of supply, including a wedge in that pie chart for conservation. So they would have, recycled water, and where they have groundwater, and they'd have their conservation, and they would show their imported water supplies.
Would there be a wedge that says Delta watershed?
There would be a wedge that would say imported water, and for that particular agency, it's water imported from.
Well, water imported wouldn't be enough necessarily, right?
Right.
It could be Colorado.
It would have to be from the Delta watershed. Yes. Sorry.
Okay. So using, if we can, because you know it so well, West Basin may be reducing its absolute dependency. I don't know. But if its imported water from the Delta Basin was 20%, to comply, it could either reduce the actual water quantity.
Correct.
Or if it went to 15%, it would be in compliance. But if the volume of water at some future point meant that the actual amount of water at 15% was more than it took at 20%, would it be in compliance?
Let's see if I can put a number on it, because the West Basins is a good example. San Diego County Water Authority is a good example. There's a couple of other agencies that have done these types of pie charts. Basically, as you compare between 2010, 2015, 2020, so you're going in these increments, you would be able to show that in 1 year, maybe you're using 10 I'm going to do it very simple, 10 acre feet of water from the Delta watershed, and you're using 20 acre feet from other sources. And maybe in the next 5 years, you're planning to do a lot of conservation. So you would show how conservation is being added into the diversification of your water supplies. So now maybe you're still using 10 of your water from the Delta. You haven't changed anything from the Delta. But because you're meeting the needs of future growth by conserving water, you'll be able to show in the denominator that you're actually diversifying those water supplies, and you're going down in terms of the percentage
So the imported
used.
water from the Delta watershed remains the same, but it decreases as a percentage.
That's an example of where it could. I was looking at another water agency's management plan last week where they were projecting an increase in water from the Delta, but because of the diversification of their water supplies, it was still, and because of their strong conservation program, it was still a reduced percentage. And so that's why we're using this reduced percentage as part of the metric.
What about the growth factor?
Growth-
If you grow by 50% and you increase your import water by 10%, you're obviously also diversifying.
The diversification, actually, what's really, exactly. One of the things that we received a lot of information on is the way in which conservation is really changing how we use water in the state. And so you have many cities. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is a great example of where in the last 25 years they've added over 1 million people to their population, but they're actually using the same amount of water as they did 25 years ago. And a lot of that's just conservation. That's just being more efficient. Now, the city is also diversifying its water supplies, and they've got very aggressive plans for the future. But I guess what the bottom line comes down to, it's recognizing it's not that the Delta is an important part of the water supplies for the state of California, but it's equally important to come up with additional diversified supplies, including conservation. And it's the conservation and the diversification that allows us to grow into a future, have more population, and have the ability to basically have adequate water supplies for those future populations and still at the same time be able to reduce pressure on the Delta.
So is what Randy raised is the EIR issues raised around it consistent with that description?
Yes, the EIR reflects the interpretation of the policy that's in the plan, yeah.
Okay. So water efficiency. So maybe it's well understood. It's the percentage.
Yeah. You guys, I remember when we had these 2 or 3 painful meetings on WR for this policy, and you and Randy finally orchestrated a settlement. It was clear to me at the time that the people who believe that the statutory language on reduced reliance should have no impact still believed that it should have no impact. And the people who believe that reduced reliance should apply tomorrow to everybody except themselves still believe that. And all these discussions, and I now read all the comment letters on the rulemaking, and the wonderful thing is many of those who communicated who had previously demanded clarity were unhappy with the clarity they received and demanded we return to a level of uncertainty instead in terms of language. I mean, this is about as processed a section as possible, and it will not benefit from further modification, in my judgment.
Bill, would you state your understanding of the policy?
My understanding of the policy, well, I'm going to read the statute. The policy of the state of California is to reduce reliance on the Delta in meeting California's future water supply needs through a statewide strategy of investing in improved regional supplies, conservation, and water use efficiency. Each region that depends on water from the Delta watershed shall improve its regional self-reliance for water through investment in water use efficiency, water recycling, advanced water technology, local and regional water supplies, and improved regional coordination of local and regional water supply efforts. Now, that is not a legislative finding. It is a statutory direction immediately following the inherent objectives of the co-equal goals. And, I just look at it and read the Delta plan. If we had an unlimited supply of water and it was increasing every year, then everybody could get a piece of the increase. But it isn't. Our supply of precipitation in California hasn't increased since 1885. And it does not take a genius to figure out if we get 97% of all the water in the boundaries of the state from rain or snow, and it isn't increasing, that we're going to have to be more efficient in use. So
So thank you for the background. So my understanding of something that Randy and I struggle with, a lot of people, is that there were competing views coming out of the legislation, and so one of the authors, Jared Huffman, called and said, no, it means an absolute reduction in what exporters take from the Delta. That's what it means. And I said, well, you didn't put it in the statute.
Right.
And so that's one view that should be absolute. Okay. What we have in the description of percentage is that every region must make its best efforts, and those are measured by the plans that they are currently required to provide the urban water management and pretty soon the agricultural water management. And they have to go through and pick their strategies and reduce their dependence on the Delta and do that. So that's the best efforts part. Then how to measure or quantify, was it their best effort? Well, they're just taking less water, so that's one possible measure. The other one is that, for whatever sets of reasons, even though they're making best efforts, the demand is greater, and so while their percentage is the same or less, their take sometime in the future might be actually more water than they took before, and that's it's in effect a compromise of the struggle between adequate water supply and trying to reduce reliance.
Do I understand the discussion here? Is it a reduce water or reduce reliance? What would the legislature say?
well, if it's reduced reliance on the Delta for water, or whether reduced water from the
Why
Delta.
didn't they just say reduce water? Is that the discussion here?
Right. Right.
Well,
They didn't say that.
The legislature said reduce reliance. Now, if I was a judge looking at this, I'd say reliance is not water. Reliance is reliance.
I'd probably argue it might be water, but it need
Could
not
be,
only be
but
water.
The legislature didn't say it was.
That's right. It said reduce reliance on the Delta in meeting California's future water needs, water supply needs.
So not to wear out my welcome, but as I described it, however halting, do you agree with that? Not what you would want, but
No,
what we have.
I reluctantly supported this resolution because I
you
thought
reluctantly appointed Randy and me to be the committee.
No, I joyfully appointed you and Randy to negotiate it. Served you guys right for doing this. But I detect very clearly that that a lot of the interest groups are attempting to define it out of existence as of no relevance. And I do not believe that to be the case.
Well, I think it has relevance. I'm not trying to define it. I'm trying to
Explain it.
Yeah, just so just like with what's our underlying authority, this is maybe the most controversial or significant, whatever. It's an important,
One of
it's
them.
one of the important things
Yeah.
that the Delta Plan's about. So having some clarity about what we're doing, I think, is worth. Whether somebody's trying to get rid of it or not is, a different.
Yeah.
People are trying to get rid of a lot of stuff. I'm trying to be sure that what we vote on this important issue is clear to us.
Phil, is this document here,
I'm advised that's a proposal from the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California to change the regulation in the Delta Plan.
this is the proposal to change?
That's my understanding. It was passed out to us by staff who said that.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, Patrick, because I think you've done a good job kind of, bringing the issue back before this body, and I appreciate the work you and Randy did in this very room some months ago. You want to just go through one more time then, for clarity's sake, as to your understanding of this, and
Go ahead.
I know you were going back and forth with Phil about what his comfort level was, but I want to just from the standpoint of the way that anybody else wants to weigh in, because I think I thought I understood pretty clearly when we last left it, but now, as we're talking through this here, I want to be sure. So I appreciate your I heard what Martha said. Okay. Yeah. Well,
Ms. Gray.
And there's different perspectives, and clearly there's some clarity that needs to be made on this issue of self-reliance or reduced reliance or reduced water. But I do have a question, because this proposed amendment to Policy 5003, and I know we can get to that under regulations, but my understanding is that this is language that was provided by staff to the question about reduced reliance.
No, the staff has proposed no additional
No, this is not what you proposed.
measures. No, we're recommending approval of the plan as before you.
No, I did not say that.
I'm sorry.
I said this was a statement that staff made when they answered the question of a stakeholder, public, whatever, about, it says this policy does not require reduction in quantity of Delta water delivered. Was this a statement that was made to the public about it?
I haven't seen the material that you're referring to. Martha, are you aware of this?
I was just made aware of it about that.
So is that something that was said to folks in terms of responding to that question?
I just want to say that Don, in that language, I think it says, this deals with water exporters. Right. Under what circumstances can you do it? Okay. And you have to meet your obligation in the Urban Water Management Plan, or the Agriculture One, to study all the ways you could reduce your dependency on the Delta, and then you have to undertake all those that are feasible. And after that, there's a measurement component. And the measurement is you're using less water that comes from the Delta watershed, or the percentage of the water you use is the measurement, which means it's no more than, and perhaps less. It can't be more. So that was the compromise. I think what Martha described is consistent with that kind of clear language in it.
So no more than, because again, that's kind of key. Well, I remember we went through a lot of discussion about this in subsequent meetings after you and Randy kind of worked through it. Even we still had some conversations. So the calculation could be, and to Judge Damrell's point a moment ago too, in making that calculation, although I thought I heard you say a moment ago, it could be more than.
Well, that's just it. I'm trying to track this conversation, so let me try again.
Okay, all right.
It is easy to get tangled up a little bit. I think we've got the first, am I on?
You are.
Okay. I think we've got the first part of the analysis, which is, now I turned myself off. There you go. Sorry about that. So the first half of this is to recognize the conversation that had gone on in the legislature and other places about one possible way of defining reduced reliance was to take or use less of water from the Delta watershed. So that is one option. What we wanted to craft was a second option that would... Sorry, there's no red button. There's just a black tape. I got it, I think, now. We wanted to craft an option that recognized that for some areas of the state, they could well be using more water from the Delta. But under what conditions would they be using it? And that goes to this question about what does reduced reliance mean? And we were focusing on the dimension of reduced reliance, which was, were you taking steps to do your conservation and water efficiency? Were you diversifying your water supply?
Don't touch that.
I didn't touch, it does go off. Sorry. I'm only technically inept. But it was trying to get at this. It's not working right. Not me?
Here's a fast repair from our experts here. Let's see if it works.
That's my favorite fix. That's right. So anyway, it was really trying to really grapple with this issue that you're going to have a growing population. There are communities that are looking at, consistent with the decisions that are made on BDCP and the consistent with the decisions that are made by the State Water Regional Control Board on the ultimate flows are going to be available from the Delta, but under scenarios where you've got communities who are saying, if the water is available, we would like to be able to use that. And we didn't want the reduced reliance policy to interfere with that. What we wanted to encourage was the diversification of the water supplies and the implementation of the water efficiency. And that's why we were trying to put the water that you would use from the Delta in the numerator, and then below that in the denominator is all the different water supplies that you're developing, and count the conservation, because the conservation counts in terms of the water efficiency. As more people are added to the population, each of those people are using their water more efficiently, and so per capita we're using less. And by putting those two metrics together, we would be able to help California move to a place where we were helping to relieve some of the stress on the Delta, be able to create more flexibility within the way water supplies are being managed throughout California, but still be able to have communities use more water from the Delta as long as they were doing these other things. And what we found in looking at all the urban water management plans, and in particular looking at the applications for the integrated regional water management plans, where this question was asked, what are you doing to reduce dependence on the Delta? The response was, this is how we're diversifying our water supplies. This is how we're conserving water. This is how we as a community, no matter where we're located in California, can contribute something back to help the Delta situation. So that's why we put it in as a metric this way.
You know, we used some language this morning regarding no project alternative. Paraphrasing that, would reduce the reliance on Delta be equivalent to reducing percentage of Delta water users' water portfolio? Is that the same thing? Reducing the Delta water users' water portfolio, the percentage of Delta water. As long as you reduce the percentage of Delta water, is that equivalent to reducing reliance? Is that something that's...
It's one of the options. We're defining it as both options, that you could actually use less, and there are communities that are planning to do that.
Use less. I said reduce the percentage of Delta water in the water users' portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yes, that is one way.
But you also have to
do
the other part. You still have to do all the strategies that you've identified that are feasible in your urban water management plan. You can't just say, well, we've got a lot more water.
And that's why we wanted the portion of the plan. It was, as you're developing your urban water management plan, and everybody, or their agricultural water management plan, and each water supplier is going to have a different set of circumstances. They're going to have a different set of options that are locally cost-effective, technically feasible. But the idea was, through this planning document and through, as Councilmember Fiorini at the time observed, it was important that people weren't just planning, they were actually commencing implementation. But it's empowering this next set of steps of saying, we know the Delta has these challenges, and it does make a difference how we use water and develop water in our own communities. We're looking through the lens of all the actions that we could take, diversification of the supplies, conservation, that would help reduce our reliance on the Delta.
If you engage in diversification and other alternatives, but your percentage of Delta water increases, your reliance on that, in other words, the percentage of your Delta water use goes up, that's contrary to what this statute means, isn't it? No matter how much you diversify, if the percentage of Delta water goes up, it seems to me that's contrary to what the statute is saying.
If you're expanding the number of water, I'm sorry, yes.
The answer is yes.
Okay.
Is it or isn't it? It seems to me
Well, I wanted to make sure I understood the question.
All I'm suggesting is that you had the pie chart, but if the percentage of Delta water that you use, no matter what you're doing with diversification and other alternatives, if it's going up, that's contrary to the intent of the legislature, isn't it? The language, reduce reliance.
We are asking communities to make those choices based on what is locally cost-effective and technically feasible. So if they've done everything they possibly could and they're still taking more water, then they've done their report. Remember, the metric is a reporting metric, so it's asking people to report on the expected outcome of the efforts that they're making.
So even if the percentage of use is going up on Delta water,
if they're compliant with all the other components of the policy, it would have to be a yes.
but they're not reducing their reliance, are they? They're increasing their reliance.
They're reducing their reliance within the capacity of that community to do locally cost-effective, technically feasible conservation and other diversification.
Could I add?
It's getting cloudier right
Yeah,
now.
and I just wanted to, if I could, bring this back to the with your permission.
Before you start, I'd like to get my question answered before it. Does policy 5003, does it require reduction in the quantity of Delta water delivered?
This would be policy WRP1. I think it's regulation, maybe is the number you're referring to, but WRP1,
Yeah,
Martha?
WRP1, yeah.
I think what she's just said, there's two ways that folks could comply with the policy. And one would be not by reducing the quantity of water, Delta water they use, but by reducing the proportion of Delta water that's in their overall portfolio. And of course, the policy has other triggers as well that also would come into play.
So do any of those things say that? Does this all the things you talked about, does it say this policy does not require reduction in the quantity of water if you meet all those things?
Does the policy say that? Again, I think I had to ask Martha, who's the expert on the fine print here. Martha?
I'm sorry, I just had somebody talking to me.
Does the policy anywhere include an explicit statement that reduction in the quantity of Delta water, there's no requirement for any agency to reduce the volume of water it uses from the Delta? Does the policy ever say that explicitly?
No.
Okay.
What we're saying in this policy, oh my dear. Sorry. Can you hear now?
I think the air conditioning system is not working.
There's a fan up.
That's a lawnmower.
I think I may try and, okay. I'm trying to think of how best to kind of cut through this a little bit and make sure that I'm not being the one who's making it confusing. In answer to your question about the policy, it's been written from the perspective of being a measurable outcome that's permissive, meaning if an agency decides that it would like to reduce the actual volume of water, and there's examples of communities that are doing that, that's one metric for how to reduce reliance on the Delta. Another metric is to expand the array of water supplies that you've developed, and in the policy from the state of California, it gives a very extensive list. In fact, it's improvements in water use efficiency and water recycling, stormwater capture and use, advanced water technologies, conjunctive use projects, local and regional water supply and storage projects. There's a whole list of things that the state of California envisioned that water suppliers could implement to basically diversify the amount of water supplies they have from various sources, and therefore have the amount of water that was coming from the Delta just be a smaller percentage of all those other water supplies. So it makes a water community, and maybe another way of thinking about it, it makes a water supplier less vulnerable to changes in what happens to the Delta water supplies. So the answer to the question is we're not requiring anybody to reduce that reliance, but we're recognizing that if that's their choice, that's a choice that we respect as a way of reducing the pressure on the Delta.
So if I could go back, though, to Pat's earlier question, Judge Amel, was the answer was yes? Martha, I don't want to put you, Martha, you've done a good sorting through, but again, that was a question of yes, and then it sounded like that didn't comport with what you just said. I heard what your explanation just a moment ago, but...
Repeat the question.
So is this a situation where you can have your cake and eat it too? It is. Or you can have your water and drink it too, or whatever.
Yes.
But
There's one exception. Unlike most of the other policy debates where water consumption stands alone by itself, we're operating under the co-equal goals.
That's correct.
And a water supply system that is at a certain level must also acknowledge the need of the Delta ecosystem for water sufficient for protection, restoration, and improvement, as the statute calls for. And these don't stand alone, although I understand the interest groups would prefer to have them stand alone. They work together. And the reason why, Pat, I was reluctant in supporting it, everybody just chooses what they don't like or what they do like, talk about that, and pass on. They are truly a balancing test. I predict to a high level of certainty that in spite of the fact the Water Board's going ahead to set new water quality standards in the Delta, many of the interest groups that, in their view, will be adversely affected by that will seek to stop or block the Water Board action. I'm convinced that over time, as has been true in the history of California for 40 years, that will be made. And human use of water has to take account of Clean Drinking Water Act standards and other requirements of law, federal and state. And it's the balancing of those interests that are there. This is I go back to the section, it's helpful in the Delta plan to think about it. This is under increase water conservation and expand local and regional supplies. It's under that nomenclature. And everybody says, oh yeah, that's fine. But you know, and we all know, that nobody wishes to be judged on whether they're using their best efforts to increase water conservation and expand local region supplies. They all say they are. But we've said, sorry, you got to prove it. You've got to bring some evidence in and show you're doing it. When we first got on this discussion, the issue was, well, what about your theory that you export water at high levels during periods of the year where the flows are the highest? Capture during peak flow periods, store, use that stored water in dry times. This is something Randy's been harping about for 3 years. What happens is, of course, nobody thinks of linking these together. They operate in a vacuum. They don't want to operate in a vacuum. The reality is water contractors are likely to see higher pumping and water delivery in some portions of a year. Just as the Delta plan says, they will see lower deliveries in other portions of a year. I mean, it doesn't, So this is one of those tough, complicated balancing tests where everyone wants it clarified that they're not affected. Well, they are affected. But as Frank indicated, this is a very focused statute. It clearly is a statute. It has meaning, but it is not controlling on all these other things. So if I look at it, and the reason I thought you guys did a good job in putting together this package is because it fits in the 14 policies that we have adopted as part of a whole. And what's going on now, this is my estimation, everybody wants to pick it apart. Whether it's pick it apart, saying, no, it has to be an absolute reduction in water for everybody in California in the next 30 minutes. Or, no, it means we get to keep all the water we've gotten forever, regardless of circumstances. No, it doesn't mean that. The statutes are clear on, the laws are clear on balancing. This process is clear. I think they all work together. They don't work when we act as if one policy alone stands alone, and we act as if that's the whole world. That's, you know, so that's why I went along. That's why I still go along. Don. Okay. I think we have just had part of our rulemaking conversation as well. All right, members, could you just go through and start asking questions on these changes in the Delta plan? And again, these are changes based on the March meeting and information. The changes are fairly minor, but as you run into them, if you would let us know, please. Anything else on Chapter 3? Okay, Chapter 4, the ecosystem chapter. Chapter 5, the unique delta. Chapter 5. Okay. Again, the formatting of this has changed in each of the chapters consistent with the action the council took in March on the rulemaking stuff, but that's format only. Cindy, I would make just one suggestion. Again, I've made it before. It's so confusing to see the CCR section numbers at the top of a box discussion in the Delta Plan when we're actually talking about Delta Plan policy, whatever, that I suggested to you. I like cross-referencing, but cross-referencing ought to be at the bottom to the CCRs. That's a lawyer's thing. If it's at the top, you say, well, it must be a brand new thing. It's not a brand new thing. It's what we've been fiddling around with for 2 years.
Okay.
And I would recommend that for your consideration. Any questions on 5? I'm done. Don.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear, because I know that some months ago we talked about legislation calls for the Delta legacy communities, and there was some terminology about unincorporated towns or something like that. So we are going to use.
Yeah, and Don, you've got updated maps, Mr. Ray, on legacy town definitions in one of the appendix, and I don't remember the initial of that appendix.
Yeah, again, we have coordinated closely with the Delta Protection Commission on the maps for the legacy communities, and I think we have an outcome that's acceptable to both parties.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't getting to the maps. I just wanted the terminology.
Yeah, the unincorporated Delta towns is the term we've used, and it's identical term that's used in the in terms of the policy on land use. We refer to them as unincorporated Delta towns. We do use the term legacy communities, I believe, in several of the recommendations.
Right.
So we pick up
190 you call them out because legislation called them out that way. So that's what I was wondering. So are those interchangeable for purposes of people's discussions or no?
Well, again, there are several of the communities that the Reform Act identifies as legacy communities that are not unincorporated Delta towns within the terminology that are used in the Protection Commission statute. An example would be Island, which is not unincorporated. Rio Vista.
Okay, so again, without trying to go through page by page, that's clear in the references, though. So they're not interchangeable. In some cases, they are one and the same, but in other cases, they're not. So that's why the definition between unincorporated and incorporated.
Yeah, and I'm confident that we've used the terms appropriately in the narrative.
And I wasn't questioning that.
Yes.
I don't want to. Okay. Thanks. Go ahead.
Okay, Chapter 6 is the water quality section. Questions on Chapter 6? I don't think if there were changes, they were fairly minor changes, technical changes in Chapter 6. Chapter 7 is the reduced risk. Again, the same kinds of chart information on sources that Mr. Natoli asked you about earlier occur in Chapter 7. This is where the standardization of designations of towns and agencies and all that occur. And this is where, as Mr. Nordhoff started off the morning, some of the language from the risk reduction regulatory language was moved into the Delta Plan as text. And once we get through with this part of the business, we will have a resolution about some of that language to direct staff at the same time. I had no questions on that. Don?
Just by way of reference, because I know we had, again, when we did the regulations. And
page number?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, 277 is the exhibit, which I think is pretty.
277?
Yeah, that's a good figure, excuse me, which has levy guidance. But what are we using for guidance, though, since that's not the governing factor when it comes to heights that are going to be calculated for.
Well, this is the change of the 200-year flood, the 100-year flood protection to a different calculation. And Mr. Ray, I know we talked about that in March and we agreed, but point out that language if you would. Please.
Well, could I ask Councilmember Natoli, what is it regarding figure 743 you were questioning?
Well, I didn't quite finish because I was going to say that this is guidance for a 200-a-year level of protection. If that were the standard that was going to be applied for levee improvements in certain areas of the delta, and yet we're going to use a different baseline. It's going to be sea level rise calculated at whatever elevation that is. And so this document, I mean, this is a good figure for what you're describing, but that's not going to be the guidance you're going to be giving to, which will be different heights or floodplain elevations based upon sea level rise.
This doesn't describe or refer to the policy about the level of flood protection that's required in rural residential subdivisions. No, this is a graphic that's designed to illustrate the 4 different types of levees, or 5 different types of levees that are found in the Delta, and show how they align with the text in the Delta plan that describes the various levee standards that have been used out there.
No, and I appreciate that, Dan. And again, I think you refine this over time. Good example, but at one time, the last diagram on this page would have been what would have been used for rural residential. You would have used a 200-year. You could either flood-proofed or had a levee of that, configuration in this figure.
I think in reality what it depicts now is the urban levees that will be used to protect the urban and urbanizing portions of Stockton, West Sacramento, and the other urban areas that meet the definitions of those urban areas and urbanizing areas that are in the Simplified Flood Protection Act.
All right, maybe I'm not asking the question clearly. So what is it that you're going to, besides you're just going to use the verbal, because it is a regulation now that you will use sea level rises calculated from Golden Gate on up, to whatever elevation. You don't have a figure.
We don't have a graphic that depicts how that would be applied, no.
Okay. Okay, that answers my question. This was helpful because it comported with everything that was being talked about before, understanding now for the rural. The 200-year wasn't very readily, if ever, achievable. And so we took this choice, or at least the council majority did, of using sea level elevation to do that. Yeah.
In terms of a floodproofing standard, yes.
Yes. Could you direct my attention to where that's called out then? Is that on page 296? Is that the description?
That would be in it's on page, my glasses are troubling me again, 256.
256 or
296. 296,
okay,
yeah.
That is it. So okay.
Yeah.
And that's the blue section's been added, and that then where it's applicable, that's the guidance that folks get relative to consistency and to how they will then calculate.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Anything else in Chapter 7, members? Okay. Chapter 8 is non-regulatory funding principles. I don't think were there any changes? There might have been a grammatical change here. I don't remember.
Yeah, very minor changes.
Now, Mr. Stevens, question, please. Do we need to go through the glossary, or is that glossary and the definition of terms part of the rulemaking discussion separately?
Yeah, in the rulemaking, we have our own definitions that you're familiar with, and those, I believe, I'm looking to Cindy, but how we incorporate those back into the Delta plan, you've envisioned what a new appendix that includes both those definitions as well as...
Well, we've got a glossary section that comes next.
Right.
And the glossary section has blue type, which is now putting the definitions into the glossary
that come
From the
in
regulation.
regulation form.
Right.
Yeah, and I understand that. I guess my practical question to you is, we've got the Delta plan, but next after this, we have the regulatory package. If the Delta plan were adopted as it is, and we next then turn to the regulatory package, and should we make a change in a regulation, it would roll back and require changes in the Delta plan as well.
That's right.
Okay, Ms. Gray, that was a question you had presented. I wanted to clarify that. And my
So, is it better to propose something now or wait for the regulation?
well, yeah, there's going to be a lot of comment on regulations if the meeting material in advance is done. My instinct is you probably want to do the regulations next, get the Delta plan out of the way, but understand that changes in a regulation will lead to changes in the Delta plan. Which is fine.
Would it make more sense to do this one now?
Well,
Have it at least
I think
considered?
one thing would be, I think before we start considering changes in the plan, we should take public testimony and have a resolution on the floor, so that then.
Well, yeah, what I want to do, but I'm going to do it just the way we did before, to see if members would put a motion. This is 2013-2, the motion that is in your binder for consideration and adoption. Get a motion, get a second on that, then get public comment, then decide what we want to do. Is that okay?
Okay.
All right.
And what I was just going to add to that, again, before we take public comment, keep in mind what we're talking about when we say potential changes to the Delta plan. So, again, most of the red line, or if all of the red line in the Delta plan is reflective of action that was directed back in March, and I think the only new material is material that's in the errata. And so obviously it's the council's decision, if you decide to make a change in the Delta plan policies or recommendations, that could
you guys will
trigger-
have to evaluate
Absolutely.
the impact of any of those changes to determine if they rise to the level significant to require a re-notice comment
They
period.
may have EIR implications.
As well. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Procedural question?
Yes, sir.
So, does it make sense, I understand you want to get a motion, I mean, you can discuss things whether or not you have a motion on the floor, but if there's interest by the council and/or based upon audience comments and we're hearing the Delta plan right now, but does it make sense from the standpoint that if you're going to hear that, maybe consider that, but you're taking this one first? The rank order doesn't trouble me so much, but I do think that if there are some suggestions, and then you got to go back in and you'll evaluate, as you just said, Chris, well, why wouldn't you leave this on the table and have that conversation since they're tied? Well, they're intimately tied. I mean, there's no question about it, I guess.
Well, yeah. So on the regulation portion, if you decide as a council that you want to make substantial changes to the regulation that are related to the text that you have before you, that's going to trigger at least another 15-day review period under the rulemaking APA rules in any event. So it's up to you how you want to deal with this. I think from a staff perspective, we thought it would probably be easier to get rid of, to take the Delta plan action first, because most of the changes, if not all of the changes that are noted in red or blue, you've already directed at a previous meeting. These have been out for quite some time now, and all we're proposing new are errata changes. And then to work ourselves to the next step, which would be the regulation.
But if a council member or a suggestion from the audience came forward, and we have this motion on the floor on the plan, and people bored down through the regulation to the plan, because that's where it ultimately lies as far as the foundational aspects for that regulation, then we might very well get right back to this plan discussion anyway.
Well, yeah. I mean, what we can do is we can reconsider and reopen.
We can do it either way. I
Yeah.
was notably unsuccessful in the first stage, asking people to only talk about the environmental impact report, because they talked about everything, which is kind of the way it's gone for 3 years, and it's not bad because of that. I'm open to suggestions, doing any changes in Delta Plan regulations now. If people want to do that, I'm happy to talk about that. I think I prefer getting the Delta Plan resolved because we acted in March to direct the staff to make these technical changes, which they've done.
And since the regulatory policies of the plan are identical to the regulations, if people have concerns about the language of the regulations, they could present them as testimony in the plan, and we can address them now. It's conceivable there'll be something that would come up in the regulatory section that it's slipped our minds that it also related to the plan, and then we'd have to cycle back.
Well, let me just
That's great.
make sure it's procedural. If we approve the plan that includes regulations, and then you're saying the format would be to look at the regulations after we approve the plan.
Yeah.
Would it make more sense to consider the regulations as part of the plan if there is some discussion about any amendment?
You can do it, in my opinion, you can do it either way.
Yeah.
Staff had proposed one way of trying to make it more efficient for your purposes, but you can do it either way.
So let me just suggest, if we can get a motion comparable to what Mr. Nordhoff has done before, put the issue on the table, then talk about how we want to raise these other questions and listen to the audience. That might be the way that's the way I'd recommend we proceed. Mr. Nordhoff?
I just had an aside, maybe something we can get a quick consensus on. The glossary is really divided into two parts. And one is a explanation of regulatory terms, and the second one is an explanation of scientific terms.
Actually, the second one is terms that are in the Delta plan itself, that are not in the regulations. So it's kind of a catch-all.
Could we make a distinction in the table of contents to show that there are in fact two? Because in the second paragraph in the executive summary, we use a word that a lot of people are not going to be familiar with, and it's not in either section. And it's a word to describe those fish that are both saltwater and freshwater.
Okay.
All right. My suggestion is let's see if we get a motion on Resolution 2013-2. That's the correct resolution you've got in front of you. See if there's a motion in the second. Then we can talk about whether we want to hear testimony first, or you want to make amendments first. Okay?
Can you phrase the motion, please?
Yeah. The motion is as it appears in your packet of material that was handed out. It is Resolution 2013-2, Attachment 4 to the file. The operative sections of the motion are: the Council directs, hereby adopts a proposed final Delta Plan as presented to it at its meetings of May 16, 17, directs the Executive Officer to incorporate A, the errata and revised executive summary presented at that meeting. B, any other changes identified and directed by the Council at that meeting. That's this meeting. So that's the saving language we can roll.
And this meeting may continue till tomorrow?
Oh, yeah, it's noticed for the 16th and the 17th.
Okay.
Yeah. And then C, any final technical and non-substantive formatting edits necessary to producing. And then as part of that, all of the mitigation measures identified in the PEIR and in the findings incorporated as attachment 2, that's what we just did earlier, that are within the responsibility and jurisdiction of the Council are adopted and incorporated into the Delta Plan through this policy. Okay? I understand it's complicated, but that's the EIR document. You bring the same language into the Delta Plan as a result of the motion. So my suggestion is we get a motion on that and see, and then I'll turn to Ms. Gray next. A motion?
I'll offer.
Okay. Mr. Feeney moves. I'll second. Okay. Ms. Gray. You got it. Okay. This could be 10 minutes. Let's go to public testimony.